That very day, 2 of them were going to a village named Emmaus, about 7 miles from Jerusalem, and talking with each other about all these things that had happened. While they were talking and discussing together, Jesus himself drew near and went with them. But their eyes were kept from recognizing him, and he said to them,
"What is this conversation which you are holding with each other as you walk?"
Are you the only visitor to Jerusalem who does not know the things that have happened there in these days?
"What things?"
Concerning Jesus of Nazareth,
who was a prophet, mighty in deed and word before God and all the people, and how our chief priests and rulers delivered him up to be condemned to death and crucified him.
But we had hoped that he was the one to redeem Israel.
Yes, and besides all this, it is now the 3rd day since this happened. Moreover, some women of our company amazed us. They were at the tomb early in the morning, and they did not find his body. And when they came back, they even said they had seen a vision of angels who said that he was alive.
Some of those that were with us went to the tomb and found it was just as the women had said, but him they did not see.
"O foolish men, and slow of heart to believe all that the prophets have spoken. Was it not necessary that the Christ should suffer these things and enter into his glory?"
And beginning with Moses and all the prophets, he interpreted to them in all the scriptures the things concerning himself. So they drew near to the village to which they were going. He appeared to be going further, but they constrained him.
Stay with us, for it is toward evening, and the day is now far spent.
So he went in to stay with them. When he was at the table with them, he took the bread and blessed and broke it and gave it to them. And their eyes were opened, and they recognized him, and he vanished out of their sight. They said to each other,
"Did not our hearts burn within us while he talked to us on the road, while he opened to us the scriptures?"
And they rose that same hour and returned to Jerusalem.
Come on, Cleopas, come on.
And they found the 11 gathered together and those who were with them, who said,
"The Lord has risen indeed, and he has appeared to Simon."
Well, he appeared to us too. He appeared to us.
And then they told them what happened on the road, and how he made himself known to them in the breaking of the bread.
One of them, named Cleopas, the other, N, that's us, is listening on, says to him, "Are you the only visitor to Jerusalem who does not know the things that have happened there in these days?" And there's this strange little word, visitor. The word which I've put in brackets in Greek is paroikes. What does that sound like to you, the word paroikes? What English word can we think of that's more or less got something like paroik? Parochial? If you said parochial, you would win Jeopardy. Parochial, linked to our word parish, and that would be exactly the word. It means beside the house. It's interestingly, our word parish or parochial is a way of saying domestic. You say, oh, your attitude is very parochial, meaning it sort of somehow stay at home. Whereas initially, paroikos meant beside the home. It was for people who didn't really have a home. Because the word, rather than being the word for visitor, is the word for resident alien. Or the old language, the old English, sojourner. Have you ever heard that word, sojourner? Someone who is living here but is not from here. It's a rather important word in the Bible, since almost anyone who's anybody of any importance in the Bible was a sojourner. They were someone who lived there but was not from there. Abraham was a sojourner, Isaac was a sojourner, Jacob was a sojourner, Joseph was a sojourner, Moses was a sojourner. Everybody lived somewhere they weren't from. They underwent that vulnerability and the dangerousness of depending on the kindness of strangers, as it says somewhere. Tennessee Williams, yeah. In other words, being the kind of person, what is a resident alien in this country? It's a green card holder. And we know, you have an Arabic surname, you live somewhere near Newark Airport, you're a resident alien, you receive a visitor from abroad who also has an Arabic surname, and guess what? The authorities want to know who's coming into the country and who they're staying with, yeah? In other words, a resident alien is someone who's not from here and therefore might be dangerous. Their capacity to exercise hospitality, their ability to know what's going on is limited. That's what a paroikos is. Are you the only resident alien in Jerusalem who doesn't know what's happened there in these days? Okay, here's a quick question. Jesus, unrecognized, has spoken to Cleopas. Cleopas's first response is to say, "Are you the only resident alien?" What has Cleopas picked up in Jesus' voice? Foreigner. What is it that we typically think of when we hear a foreigner ask a question of this sort? Oh, they wouldn't get it, they're not from here. Isn't that our typical reaction? Oh, I'm going to have to explain it all to you in words of one syllable because you're dumb. The kind of person who needs everything explained to them. Listen, we don't really get it, that's why we're arguing. How much less are you going to get it? You're an outsider. You're not really inside the whole swim of these things. So we're going to have to explain it to you really in letters of 2 syllables, yeah? But it's interesting that the first thing they pick up about this person who has spoken to them is the sort of person who wouldn't get it. Unlike us, we're the insiders. This is the sort of person who we're going to have to explain things and treat as if he was a little kid and a bit dumb, really. Okay. So are you the only resident alien in Jerusalem who doesn't know the things that have happened there in these days? And then he says to them, what things? Well, some people think of this as Jesus playing cutesy, I know what was going on in Jerusalem because it was all about me, moi. But I'm going to play dumb. I'm going to sail under the flag of stupidity and see whether these guys know what's going on. Then I'm going to show them up for being the dumbheads that they are. That's a way of reading this, this passage. I don't think that's very plausible. Another way of reading it is to say that actually that Jesus was in such a different space, what we would now call a zone. He was in such a different zone. His whole approach to what had been going on was so different that hearing these guys jabbering on pointlessly was rather like an enormous fish that lives at the very, very bottom of the Mariana Trenches, attempting to work out what's splashing around on the foam at the surface of the sea is. It's in a completely different place. It makes no sense at all. In other words, he simply couldn't get what they were talking about. Another possibility is this, that whatever it was they were talking about, he knew that the only way, and this takes us back to what we were talking about anthropology before, the only way to begin to get them to make sense of it was to try to get them to tell the story. In as far as they could stop squabbling with each other and actually try to get a story out. Even if it was a story with lots of holes in it, the beginnings of a narrative are also the beginnings of being able to be reached by a different account of the story. So actually it's a pulling them into a storytelling place, which is also, as we're going to see, going to be a pulling them into a place of having their story opened and then being given another story. So the what things is a see if I can pull you into becoming a storyteller. So, in reply to that, we see what Luke does. He gives us their attempt, the attempt by Cleopas and N, to begin to try to tell the story. And in fact, they can't make any sense of it at all. They've got 5 different angles going on at the same time. Each one of the things that they say now is, if you like, is a different interpretative thread. We would say, in grand modern term, they have no hermeneutical principle. There is no unified narrative by which they can make sense of this. So they say, well, concerning Jesus of Nazareth, okay, that's a physical, historical bloke who was a prophet. Okay, well, the moment you call someone a prophet, you're into the realm of interpretation. Because what is meant by a prophet? Well, different people are going to have different takes on someone being a prophet or someone being a troublemaker. You've already entered the realm of interpretation. But they say, no, he was a prophet, mighty in deed and word before God and all the people. In other words, a publicly known person who was known to have done certain things, about whom there was buzz, if you like, and how our chief priests and rulers delivered him up to be condemned to death. Okay, well, that's a bit of a blow for the prophet narrative, because in a conquered country, which is what Palestine was at the time, under Roman rule, you could expect chief priests and rulers rather to be pleased to have a prophet around. It's the kind of thing that boosts their side, if you like. So it's an odd narrative if the chief priests and rulers, who rather than say, oh, goody, goody, someone has turned up to boost our view of things, they say, oh, let's get rid of him quickly, and actually entrust him into the care of the civil authority, the Romans, in order to get rid of him. So this makes the prophet narrative odd. And how is one supposed to interpret someone who is a prophet relating in this sort of way with the religious leaders? If someone is really a prophet, the whole point of the religious leaders is they're supposed to recognize it and say, yippee. So here we have a little conflict of interpretation. But we had hoped, that was Cleopas and En and the group, that he would be the one to redeem Israel. Okay, here's another stream of interpretation. Because at the time, there was a current of people who looked back to the ancient glories of Israel, as they imagined, and thought of the returning Messiah, prophet, king, priest, who would bring back the first temple, bring back the kingdom of Israel, bring back the lost tribes, all of which had been lost at different stages of the past, and would redeem, restore Israel, make it once again the Israel that they read of in the scriptures of old. And so they had focused their attention on Jesus as being this priestly, prophetic figure who would bring back the temple, bring back the 12 tribes. After all, why had he named 12 disciples if it was not as a sign of the bringing back of the 12 tribes? So they'd had a certain, if you like, spectrum of hopes and interpretations already available to them, which had somehow been let down by everything that had gone on. Yes, and besides all this, it's now the 3rd day since this has happened. The 3rd day was also there were a few scriptural comments about 3rd days, but no one was quite sure what they meant. But there was something about someone being raised on the 3rd day. Moreover, some women of our company amazed us. Brackets, women in our system, talking about the Jewish system at the time, 2nd-degree witnesses, not really reliable, not people who could give proper witness in a court. So, some women of the company amazed us. They were at the tomb early in the morning and did not find his body, and they came back saying that they'd even seen a vision of angels. So, tomb, no body, vision of angels, who said that he was alive. Again, different elements of interpretation, no way of putting this together. Some of those who were with us went to the tomb. In other words, we thought to ourselves, the boys have got to sort this out, can't rely on the girls, and found it just as the women had said, but him they did not see. So they found the empty tomb, they saw nothing. Now, do you see you have about 5 different lines of interpretation going on there? Very, very briefly, in 5 sentences, St. Luke has opened up a whole array of confused lines, different versions of story that could be taken any variety of ways, but none of which make sense altogether. And this is where Jesus says to them, "O foolish men, and slow of heart to believe all that the prophets have spoken." So first of all, he gives them a good, straightforward, Old Testament upbraiding, exactly the kind of thing that you would expect someone to say. Then he says, "Was it not necessary that the Christ should suffer these things and enter into his glory?" Okay. Was it not necessary? He is going to propose an unitary reading. That's what the little phrase necessary works out as meaning. He's saying there is a single account of why all this had to happen. And once you see why it had to happen, it makes perfect sense. There is a complete narrative which makes sense of all these things that you're describing. And I'm about to give it to you. Furthermore, it's a narrative that fulfills all those things in the prophets, which you've been batting around with each other in your crazy way. That's what he's about to say. So, unitary hermeneutic about to be offered. Now, please notice that it's, at this stage, a bloke talking about a bloke. Although Luke has tipped us off that it's Jesus, he refers to the Christ. This is a third-party exercise. This is a hymn talking about a hymn. No mention of I at this stage. Yeah? This is a hymn talking about a hymn. Then it says, beginning with Moses and all the prophets, he interpreted to them in all the scriptures the things concerning himself. And I put in Greek the little words after he interpreted to them, and the Greek word is dihermeneusen autois, from which we get our word hermeneutic, meaning the science of interpretation. In other words, what is St. Luke talking about? Having tipped us off that this is going to be an interpretation of dream story, he's going to talk about, yes, this is what the living interpretative principle looks like. This is a hymn coming alongside and offering the living interpretation, the unitary interpretation of all these texts. And it says, with all the scriptures, starting from Moses and all the prophets. Now, please notice, we don't actually know what all those books were. One of the things that has happened since this period is that the canons of scripture have been fixed. At this time, at the time of the first century, the canon of Hebrew scriptures was actually a much broader range of writings than is currently to be found in the Hebrew Bible. After this period, a number of writings were excluded. So actually, we don't know what the full range of the scriptures to which was referred at the time. We get some sense that it was probably broader than what we have, just by the fact that contemporarily at the Qumran caves, some manuscripts were found that were clearly regarded as sacred books at the time, which were contemporary with Christ, which have not made it into the final cut, if you like. So when he says Moses and all the prophets, don't think that he's saying he picked up a Bible and went through it. There wasn't a Bible at the time. There was an as yet unfixed collection of rolls, if you like. Of course, the major books which we associate were there, and they varied actually comparatively little between that time. The real editing period was probably in a couple of hundred years immediately before that. But between the time of Christ and our current version of the Hebrew Scriptures, there's comparatively little editing going on. Some things excluded, and some interesting textual variations, but much the same thing as we have now. Okay, but what's really interesting is that when he says he interpreted them starting with Moses and all the prophets, we hear this as religious books. He took their religious literature and went through it with them. And that would be a great mistake, because actually this was the whole of their cultural heritage, much more than him going through a list of religious books. This is like him going through their basic historical and cultural and religious picture of who they were. This would be like someone starting with the Pilgrim Fathers and working through the whole of American history, but from an angle that you've never heard the story told before, so that you suddenly get to hear the story of the Pilgrim Fathers and of the Louisiana Purchase and of the Civil War and of the Great Depression and the healthcare reform, all from a perspective that you never ever heard before, as it were, someone giving you a completely new angle on it. But it's your story that formed you and in which you had been brought up, that is being given back to you from a perspective that you'd never heard it before. In other words, it's not merely something you knew about, it's something that had made you who you are. Your ability to relate to your culture had been given to you through those stories which you had picked up, just as in modern America. It's, there are a whole lot of things that you pick up immediately that are specifically American, and that when people don't behave like that, you say, but that's not how we do things here, that's not us. Okay, there would be similar package of being, if you like, given by all these accounts. So what Jesus is doing is giving them back to themselves in an entirely different way, but in such a way that they say, gosh, no one's ever told us that that's what we were before. And in listening to it, they're finding themselves transformed, as you are when you suddenly become, if you like, find yourself occupying a different space in the story that you had thought made you who you are than the one you in fact occupy. Okay, so he's giving them back to themselves with the story. At this point, they draw near to the village to which they were going. He appeared to be going further, but they constrained him. Now there's a good little Lucan Yahwistic touch, because one of the things that God does in the Hebrew Scriptures is go past and have to be hauled back. This is a little indication that what's really going on here is what we would call a Yahwistic theophany, an appearance of Yahweh. Do you remember God goes past Moses? Moses can't see him face to face. Moses only gets to see what in the King James Version is referred to as his hind portions. Always rather a marvelous picture of God going by and Moses only getting to see the hind portions. In the book of Job, God goes past and has to be reached back. In St. Mark's Gospel, you remember Jesus walks past on the water and has to be hoiked back into the boat. This is one of the ways of referring to appearances of God, which is that it's always something that's just out of reach, and as you grasp it, it disappears. This is part of the sense of the Yahwistic theophany, God putting in an appearance, a real appearance of God. So Luke is preparing us, because that's exactly what's about to happen. They drew near to the village to which they were going. He appeared to be going further, but they constrained him, saying, "Stay with us, for it's toward evening, and the day is now far spent." So he went in to stay with them. Okay, now please remember what's happened. These two insiders have picked up that outsider doesn't really get it. Outsider has come up to them, has retold them the whole of their story from a protagonism that they had never imagined before, so that they, who'd thought themselves the insiders and knew what were going on, suddenly find themselves occupying quite a different space. They then go into their house. They invite him in, so they're the hosts, and he's the guest. And yet when he was at the table with them, he took the bread and blessed and broke it and gave it to them. In other words, once again, the protagonism is being altered. The guest is mysteriously acting like the host. And it's in his doing that they recognize him. They've been undergoing this strange alteration whereby a he, who was at first an outsider, has gradually been getting closer and closer in, as it were. And now he's being the host in their own house. And they recognize the gesture of the breaking of the bread and the blessing as being something that Jesus had done. And these were, after all, people who had been with Jesus during his earthly ministry. And it says, and their eyes were opened, and they recognized him, and he vanished out of their sight. Now, because we're English speakers, that sounds like 3 discrete movements. First, their eyes were opened, oh! And they recognized him, ooh! And he vanished out of their sight, bye! As though it was 3 different, moments. But that's, of course, that's not the case in Greek. This is all one sentence, and there isn't any punctuation. These are different, if you like, different aspects of the same moment. The opening to them of the eyes, and it's the passive, the moment of recognition, and what it says is, he unappearing became. That he vanished makes it sound, he went off somewhere, right? He unappearing became. It's quite a different, sense of movement. Now, please notice exactly what has happened at that moment. He, unrecognized, talking about him, had managed to tell them a story which radically altered their protagonism, their sense of who was in charge of the story. The he then comes into their house, radically alters their sense of protagonism of who is host and who is guest. And then finally is recognized as being not a he at all, but I am. Suddenly they realize they haven't been hearing a he story. They haven't been hearing a third person describing a third person. They have been hearing I am, which of course is the name of God. That is what Yahweh gave himself to be known as. I am has been doing all this. It is I am's story. And it was what they recognized in the breaking of the bread was I am. This is what we would call a Yahwistic theophany. This is the real presence of Yahweh known in the breaking of the bread. The real protagonist has given an interpretation and manifested himself as the interpreter and the one about whom it was being interpreted at the same time. The whole of their protagonism has been completely altered and, exactly as is appropriate, has been unable to be grasped. And because it's I am, it's actually, after they've recognized him, there is only them. Each of them has been given a new I because it's been reconstituted in a different way. So they said to each other, did not our hearts burn within us while he talked to us on the road, while he opened to us the scriptures? You can say, yes, well, of course it did. Of course their hearts did. Your whole story was being given to you anew. The whole of your belonging to your culture was being told anew. But what's amazing is that now these two, who'd been having this anti-ballistic discourse, you remember before, now they're singing from the same hymn sheet. Now they're talking together. They're being able to tell the same story. In other words, they have undergone the unitary interpretation and are able to tell the same story. And they rose that same hour and returned to Jerusalem. Real place, real significance. And they found the 11 gathered together. That's the A team minus Judas, who, if you remember, had gone off to hang himself. The 11 gathered together, and those who were with them, that's the rest of the B team, who said, the Lord has risen indeed and has appeared to Simon. Well, that's the phrase known to New Testament scholars as the kerygma, the initial announcement, which appears in different places in the New Testament. So this is, if you like, the official announcement. This is the A-team official announcement. The Lord has risen and has appeared to Simon, or to Cephas, or Peter, the same person. Cephas, which is merely the Hebraic form for rock, the Aramaic form for rock. So then they, that's Cleopas and En, told what had happened on the road and how he was known to them in the breaking of the bread. In other words, they then share their account with the B team and the A team, and it's confirmed. Do you see how subtly Luke has set up this structure? Okay, we'll have a little pause now, and then I want us to go back and have a look at the tone of voice. We're going to try and pick up something about the tone of voice of the one who was speaking to them on the road.